When you think of Victorian mansions, what comes to your mind? Haunted, rotting mansions that loom menacingly over the landscape? Ghost stories? Scooby-Doo, perhaps? The once elegant mansions were a symbol of class and elitism, but now they are all but thought of as haunted and antiquated. Take a moment to look at Edward Hopper's 1925 House by the Railroad. There's something in the way Hopper depicts this Victorian mansion that feels so haunting. But where did this idea come from? How did the Victorian style become synonymous with ghoulish and haunted? The Victorian period was a time of significant progress and economic success that was born out of darkness. The Western world had been shrouded in death. From the American Civil War to the cholera breakouts in England, death had become an extremely common occurrence. Coming out of this tomb of death and despair came the promises of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought more money to the cities and created a new rich class, the nouveau riche. Unlike the rich families of the old world, which had inherited their money and had prized themselves on making sure there was money to be saved and passed down from generation to generation, the new rich were defined by their excessive spending. They had never had this much money before, and they wanted everyone to know that they were rich. This period is also known as the American Gilded Age. This was because of a surplus in wealth that came rapidly with factories. However, this was a time of great economic disparity. The new rich were becoming richer each day and not fairly paying their employees, as well as this is a great time when we begin to see environmental impact of industrialism. This time is also known as the Gilded Age because it's the first time in American history that Americans really had excessive money, and they looked to emulate on how to be rich from Europe. But Europe wasn't looking towards modernism at this point. They were actually looking towards medievalism. The Victorian period wasn't one that just looked towards the future in industrialism. It was also defined by the Gothic Revival. The Gothic Revival movement was the reviving of an old medieval style. Starting in France as a reclamation of a national history and identity, Gothic churches that had fallen into despair over years and through wars were beginning to be renovated and restored to their former glory. This revival of medieval Gothic style soon began to inspire the new rich. Authors like Victor Hugo wrote stories that took place in the medieval period. And there was a huge spike in interest in Arthurian legends and stories. The medieval styles inspired Victorian, from clothing to homes. Victorian homes took inspiration from the Gothic asymmetrical aesthetic, borrowed their towers and pointed arched windows, as well as took their bloated slanted roofs from the French imperial style. They were painted bright colors and had a maze of corridors that were cluttered with furniture and expensive objects. They only wore the finest clothing and adorned their homes with the finest of wallpapers. Their houses were covered from head to toe in beautiful detailed woodwork. And this was all just to shout that their wealth and importance to the world. Even the lower class imitated the nouveau riche the Victorian was in, and seemingly here to stay. And for most of the 19th and early 20th century, it would appear so. But then there was a change. As the factories that once made people rich began to close and the money began to dry up, World War One would strike. And after World War One, the Victorian style was seen as excessive, disgustingly flamboyant, and no longer relevant. World War One changed how the Western world existed. Americans were now interested in progress and modernity. There was no longer this need for tasteless opulence. The interest in the medieval period had ended. Art Nouveau was replaced by modernism, and the Victorian became antiquated. These homes began to be deserted, and even by the mid-1920s, when Hopper painted the house by the railroad, many of these homes had been abandoned and were beginning to fall into disrepair. By the Great Depression, the majority of these homes were used as boarding homes. Without the money to keep up with all the work, the delicate and detailed woodwork rotted away, and these homes were now symbols of death and decay. It didn't help that most of what was remembered about the Victorian period was high death rates, obsession with death and dying, and homes filled with toxic materials. The Victorian was no longer seen as ornate, but rather as a reminder of how awful the Gilded Age looked in retrospect. By 1934, these homes were called grotesque and were accused of desecrating the landscape. However, this isn't what forever sealed the fate of Victorian homes. While they were becoming associated with death and decay, any hope of them once returning to their former glory was stomped out by someone you might not guess. Charles Addams. Charles Addams was a cartoonist working for the New Yorker. He created many notable characters, but his most famous family would be the ghoulish clan themselves, the Addams family. They were a collection of kooky recluses that were morbidly obsessed with death and supernatural.
If I wanted to kill my husband, I'd do it, and I wouldn't get caught.
They were a subversion of the ideal American family.
A toast to the glorious mysteries of life, to all that binds a family as one, to mirth, to merriment, to manslaughter.
And in 1945, Addams would hammer the last nail into the Victorian mansion's coffin, forever dooming these homes to be known as decaying, haunted, and antiquated. He revealed that the family of death lovers lived in a Victorian home of their own, and his reasoning for this was that Victorians were better for haunts. From that moment on, Victorians became a way to tell audiences that something sinister was afoot. By 1960, audiences coming to see Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho already knew right away that the Bates Mansion was a place of unspeakable horror, and all Hitchcock had to do was make it a Victorian. To this day, we still see the Victorian home used this way. From the Pink Palace in 2009's Coraline to 2019 when The Sims 4 released their latest game pack, Strangerville, and they had created this whole neighborhood of Victorian homes, but the neighbors who lived there were up to no good. Netflix in 2019 gave viewers The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and Sabrina and her aunts lived in a Victorian mansion that was looming over a cemetery. And because of our associations with the Victorian style, due to a century worth of media depicting it a specific way, we can't help but feel like something's off in all of these instances. The Victorian period has been painted with broad strokes, making it seem like it was a period full of death and decay that was then covered with glitter and gold to hide all the cracks beneath. I can't agree with that, but it is undeniable that in the 21st century that the Victorian style still exists as a visual metaphor for death, decay, and the paranormal. If history has proven anything, it's that time changes our perceptions. And we can see how that would change the Victorian into a house of haunts. And we can also see the same exact thing happening to the Victorians, happening to another architectural style, the McMansion. The McMansion is a modge podge of architectural styles all wrapped up into one behemoth structure. Much like the Victorians of yesterday, these homes are supposed to impose their wealth and announce to the world their value. And much like the Victorian mansions, the ones that are abandoned have fallen into disrepair and have become symbols of decay and death. They're quite creepy and haunting. Modern viewers call these homes grotesque and eyesores. Does this mean the McMansion will become the new Victorian, though? Will a remake of Psycho feature a McMansion menacingly looming over a cute motel? Most likely not, but it's a fun idea to laugh over. Unlike every other outdated and antiquated style, the Victorian has become our symbol for horror for almost a century, and it doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon.